Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Virtual Ninja Show. My name is Heike, and today I have for me a special guest, which is Ru. Ru is an MVP, a most valuable professional. And yeah, Ru, please introduce yourself.
Cool. Well, first off, thanks for the invitation. Honor to be with you. So yeah, I'm Ru Campbell. I work for a Microsoft partner called Threatscape, and we help customers across everything to do with Microsoft security. So from Defender to Purview, Entra, and all points in between. And one of the areas that I specialize in and that we're going to talk about today, I guess, is on, Defender for Endpoint, best practices and configuration management and all that kind of stuff. So really helping, in addition to security engineers, helping IT pros understand the end user experience of Defender for Endpoint.
Yeah. And you know how I got to you? I actually went to LinkedIn Learning and I found your course on Defender for Endpoint. And that's how I reached out again after a little while that we haven't been in contact. But besides that course, I think you also wrote a book and are currently writing a book about the same topic. Tell us a little bit about it.
Correct, yes. So I even got the books here. So I got a book out called Mastering Microsoft 365 Defender.
Show it a little bit more.
Let's go for it. There we go. So I got a book out called Mastering Microsoft 365 Defender. We're currently writing the second edition of that called Mastering Microsoft Defender XDR because the product moves on. And then I'm also in the process of writing the second edition of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint in Depth.
Oh,
which
wow.
goes very specific into Defender. So one goes wide and one goes deep. And I'm working on that with Paul H. on the Defender team. So yeah, keeping busy. And it's all good stuff, right? And some of the stuff that we'll talk about in the show today, we cover in even more detail in the books.
Mhm. Yeah, and when we had our discussion about what could you bring to the Ninja Show, we talked about especially, as you said, best practices in endpoint configuration and settings, because they don't fit all the same persona or like the same organization, right? We have smaller companies, medium, we have bigger ones, and they might look at settings and configuration a little bit different. Like, how did you find out what works best for individual customers?
Yeah, great question. And it's important because I find that Microsoft Defender is very unique in the market insofar as Microsoft cater to every size and shape of customer, right? So we have to therefore shape Defender into specific sizes and shapes of customers. And really through a combination of just working with everything from companies that maybe have 5 or 10 folks to companies that have 100,000 plus folks, that helped me get a reasonably good understanding of, well, what does good Defender design look like, right? Insofar as we've got a lot of stuff to play with, how do we tune it and mold it into something that works for us exactly? And the biggest mistake I see folks make is they have one Defender policy and that goes out to everybody. And that's fine, but I guess what I could say is it's not optimal and there's some improvements we could make there.
And where do you even start, right? Because Defender for Endpoint, for me, I always call it's such a big beast of a product, right? So we have the pre-breach side of the house, which comes with antivirus and attack surface reduction. Also, threat and vulnerability management is part of that concept. Yeah. And then we move on to all the other things that you need to configure for the post-breach.
Yep, 100%. And I guess to your point, it's like when one of the ways I kind of describe Defender for Endpoint in the books and in the training, it's almost like a product of products. There's a lot of stuff that goes into Defender for Endpoint, from the antivirus on the local side to the EDR in the cloud. And so I guess typically my starting point for describing that is you've got your service level settings. We're going to configure those in the portal, and then they're going to kind of apply to everything in the portal. And we can do the demo later to explain that. But then you've also got your client-side settings, and these are going to be things that are applied and enforced on the Windows endpoint or the Mac endpoint or the Linux endpoint. So those are the two big distinctions that folks need to consider.
When you say on the portal side, which is usually, I think most of the settings are then for the entire tenant, right? Versus the individual policy settings can be set to groups of devices. Is that
That's a pretty good summary of it. Yeah, and it's kind of evolved over time, right? As Defender has matured over time. Let me show you the portal, right? And I'll do a demo here to demonstrate it. So we head to security.microsoft.com, the security portal, the Defender portal, call it what you want. And down in the bottom left here, I'm going to head into system settings. And if I head there and then go to endpoints, so specifically Defender for endpoint stuff, and then I wait for this advanced features page to load. This is really what we're talking about when we refer to the things you mentioned earlier, insofar as these are kind of tenant-wide settings, right? So these are, for the most part, going to apply across the board. So for example, enable EDR in block mode, allow block file, and tamper protection. These are, I don't want to say no-brainers, but these are very easy, and you just go in here, boom, turn it on. Of course I want tamper protection for everything in my environment, right? And this will do two things. It will, number one, for settings that apply on clients, is going to force it down to those clients. So tamper protection, that applies to Windows. So Windows is going to pull that setting. But then for something more like, let's say, Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps integration, the client doesn't really touch that to an extent, but it's going to be enforced through the Defender portal. So that's part of the story.
Also, for everyone, I just wanted to mention, so we're not going into what all these settings now do on the endpoint. There is a lot of documentation out there. We really just want to talk about the best practices. So just to make sure that there's no wrong expectations here.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what the book's for, and that's what the documentation's for, right? Because we could go on for hours talking about that. And so in terms of best practices to call out, like I said, tamper protection, EDR in block mode, allowing block file, it's very rare that you wouldn't do these, right? There may be some edge cases, but it's very rare that you wouldn't do things like that. Where one of the, I would say, less recognized best practices comes out of is live response. Now, live response, as we know, kind of lets you get a terminal session to clients. It's great for that kind of real-time, hands-on keyboard incident response. But before you go gung-ho and just turn it on, the thing I call out here, maybe like everything else, make sure your permissions are well ordered, insofar as this is a tenant level setting. So by enabling live response, I'm enabling anyone who has the live response permission to get onto a device and do things on it. So the most highly privileged devices on my environment, like domain controllers and certificate servers, they kind of get system level permission to those, right? So that's great for threat protection, but you kind of have to consider RBAC when you go into it, and the portal calls that out as well.
But the three that you just mentioned, now, of course, if someone has Defender for Cloud Apps, you want to toggle that on, that connection there. We have tamper protection and we have live response. So those are the three that you really suggest, despite the size of an organization, to turn on, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I guess it would be fair to say that with some exceptions, as I kind of scroll up and down this list, it would be very rare that you wouldn't go in and turn one on that intuitively you would want. Maybe one that I would call out that requires a little bit of context on your own organization is something like device discovery, because there may be privacy implications and things like that. But on the whole, for the most part, you're going to want to be turning these on. Where more nuance comes into things are that some of the settings here, well, they'll only apply to certain device groups if you go in and force it, right? So as an example, web content filtering, well, sure, you'll turn the web content filtering feature on, but then to say, well, what web content gets filtered, that's where you go away and design policy and then target that to device groups.
Okay, so this is then in addition to the tenant-wide toggle, you still need to do something for endpoint via the policy. I know we also have settings in the portal, right, for web content filtering that then also apply globally, or is that misunderstanding?
Correct, yes. So what we're kind of doing in this page, in this advanced feature page, is we're saying, hey, turn this on as a generally available capability for the tenant. And then if we then go into the rules section and go into the web content filtering rules, that's where I can build a specific policy and then target that to specific device groups that exist in Defender for Endpoint. So there's everything turning it on and then kind of pushing out the rule to folks, if that makes sense.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Now, where the kind of next management pane is if we think of everything I've just showed you as being what I describe as the tenant level settings or the service level settings. And they originate in the cloud and they get pushed down to clients from there. Well, there's a little bit more to the equation insofar as if I head to endpoints and then I go to endpoint security policies, this is going to be where I can configure ultimately what you'd call Defender antivirus policies and attack surface reduction policies. So things that are more enforced by the client. So think of things like scanning schedules, exclusions, attack surface reduction rules. They're all configured over here. And this is where you can get into that concept of personas that we mentioned earlier as well. One of the neat things that you need to know about this as well is the way I describe this is the page we're looking at now. Really what we're looking at here under the hood, fundamentally it's Intune policies. We can configure it here in Defender, then configuration management, or we can head to the Intune portal and go into the endpoint security blade and do it there. It's kind of like two doors that lead into the same house. So if I make a change here, I'm going to see that over in Intune. And the advantage of that is it means, hey, well, if I've got multiple IT teams, some of them are security folks, some of them are endpoint compute folks, they can both kind of get that visibility and that control as well.
So, Ru, I think you mentioned something super important, which is that Intune connection, not connection. So what you see here is Intune. So if you go to Intune and you create a policy, it's there. If you added a policy here, you added it there. So it's not synchronized and then you have conflicts or something. It is on it. But I know that some customers are still struggling a little bit understanding what are these policies now versus the policies in Intune.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What's your best practice, by the way, Ru, for permissions here, right? Because historically, most customers that are using that portal is vulnerability manager or security analysts. And in the past, we had the IT team that focused on the settings. And now I think the lines are getting not blurry, but the security persona can also, if they have the right permissions in Intune, configure security settings. How are you approaching that?
Yeah, 100% insofar as I'm seeing the same thing you kind of mentioned there as far as there's a little bit of a convergence of security responders, security engineering, and then your maybe traditional IT operations. The kind of, tools like Intune are kind of bringing them closer together. But that said, if you do have that requirement for a hard divide to say, well, I get my security folks and I want them to see client policy but not be able to control it, the new unified role-based access control in the Defender portal, it lets you configure that, right? So for example, I could have a persona that can go in and edit these policies, and I could have a persona that gets view-only access to these policies.
I think the view only is already so priceless, right? So you see what has been configured. You can then talk to the people that are responsible for changing the policy. It was like, hey, I saw this and this and this is configured that way. Can we please change it? If you don't have insights and you have it in the same product, but we don't want to talk about that integration. Anyway, but I'm just still super excited that this is there. Also per device, right? So you go to a device and you can see which policies apply to that device. This is just wow.
Absolutely. That's a great one that I'll maybe just show on screen just now. So one thing that folks should absolutely be aware of is a kind of a new capability in Defender insofar as currently if you have to have preview features enabled, but if you go to a device and then go configuration management, effective settings, it'll tell you, hey, here's the setting that applies on that device. And what's even cooler is you get to see where it's coming from. So as an example, if it's coming from tamper protection, which is kind of like Microsoft's managed best practices, and it's going to enforce them. So it says, hey, you've tried to change this feature, but tamper protection is going to lock it down. Or similarly, if it's coming from a default setting or group policy or any of that kind of stuff. So it really helps IT pros resolve conflicts and all that kind of good stuff.
Do you have a similar view on the Intune side of the house?
Great question. do to some extent, but this makes it, I guess you could say, this makes it more accurate, right? Because what this does, this pulls from Defender itself rather than Intune.
Yeah.
So we get that more kind of, I don't want to call it real time, but it's just a different source of authority. And it will also show us the effective setting and where it came from. And Intune, for example, would not show us where it came from, because if it came from group policy, Intune might not know that, right? But the Defender portal will.
So, Ru, if I look at all your policy names, I have kind of the assumption that you have a rule for each feature function. It's not that you say all up AV or everything, or do you have some logic?
Yeah.
So what are all these rule names here?
Yes, there is method to the madness, I guess. So maybe one of the first things to call it is a lab environment. When I do production stuff, the naming convention is a little bit different.
Okay.
But the main thing that I draw folks' attention to is, for example, so I've got MDAV, which means Defender Antivirus, and then I've got levels 1, 2, and 3. And then similarly for updates, I also have a ring 1, a ring 2, and a ring 3. And this really goes to one of the core common mistakes I see folks make, insofar as they think it's one policy for everyone, right?
Mhm.
And that might be fine if you're a small environment, but if you're anything at scale, you probably want to architect Defender so that it has different levels of security for different types of user and scenario. So if I explain that with an example, if we take developer workstations, these are folks who may be working with a lot of unsigned code, a lot of brand new code that has never been seen. Take that persona and then compare it with maybe a domain controller where it's kind of static, not a lot changing, or maybe compare it with our VIP users who they're maybe using the Office client apps, but they aren't doing a whole bunch of kind of new and inventive stuff. Well, what we can do then is we can say, well, maybe for our development users, we can't leverage capabilities like block at first sight and high levels of cloud delivered protection. But for our other users who are using more kind of reliable and tried and tested apps, we can throw a little bit more security at that. So you're really designing Defender around squeezing as much protection out as possible, depending on the type of personas in your company.
Without impacting the productivity.
Yes, yes, exactly. It's a balancing act, right? And that's the whole point. And as we know, there's a whole bunch of cool stuff in Defender that lets you kind of track that, like report only mode and ASR rules and all that kind of good stuff as well.
So, and when you say MDAV updates, ring 1, 2, 3, is that also a group of people, devices that get the update pushed out first, and then the second, and then what are these rings for you when it comes to updates?
Spot on. Insofar as, well, Microsoft internally, before updates hit the kind of general public, they have what they call safe deployment practices, which is where it kind of goes through stages internally at Microsoft before it makes its way out. But internally within an IT organization, you can then control updates for Defender like you'd control updates for Windows. And I think that's IT pros and sysadmins, they've got a really good hand on that. It's just a case of extending that logic over to Defender. So as an example, if I head into ring 1 here, if we look at the configuration that I might apply here, we can see in my ring 1, I'm being, maybe you could almost say a little bit more aggressive insofar as I'm actually going to throw some preview updates out there. So these are users who are kind of going to be my test environment. But then if we jump over and go further down the chain and say, hey, let's go to ring 3, these may be devices where uptime is more critical, maybe users who, frankly, I don't want to upset that kind of persona. If we head in there, we can see that we're changing that. And we can even use, this would be maybe under exceptional circumstances, but we've even got an update channel that's called critical time delay. And that says, well, after the updates have gone to basically everyone else, we'll wait 2 days and then you'll get them. And so where something like critical time delay is very valuable is if you've maybe got frontline assets that are the kind of core revenue drivers for your business. The example I always use would be things like, you're at the airport or you're at the checkout, stuff like that, where if that device goes down, that's going to be big problems. So this is all just about kind of figuring out that balance between uptime versus cutting edge protection.
So, Ru, when you have these conversations with your customers, How long does it usually take to get to that point first to really not divide, but like specify the different groups and devices so that you then basically can get to the next phase of like, what are these settings that we should apply? Because often I think, yes, I can't say they don't know what they have. They know what they have, but like that separation, it takes a while, right?
Mm. Yeah, there could be quite an extensive discovery process, I guess, because, well, frankly, Defender can make that discovery process easier because things like device discovery, you might find out you've got a lot of devices you didn't even know about, right? So that complicates things. I would say for organizations who have a good inventory management system, they know their users, they know what they do. Maybe they've got things like app control in place that limit the allowable behavior anyway. So it's going to be, I don't want to say easy, but it's going to be simple to design the persona for those. And then in other cases, your bigger, more complicated environments, especially where there's more kind of freedom for the users to do what they want, if they've got local admin, all that kind of stuff, that can complicate the design process. And kind of like, as I'm showing on screen just now, the simplified version that I will sometimes use is what you're seeing on screen, where we've got level 1, 2, and 3. And it's a bit of a crude analogy, but you can kind of think of it as a dial between level 1, 2, and 3 in terms of, just how, dare I say, aggressive am I going to be in my pursuit of security. And if I illustrate that by heading into our level 3 policy, which is kind of that's our biggest, baddest kind of policy for security. And what I'll draw folks' attention to is if we head into specific setting here called the cloud block level. And I tell you what, I'll go to edit it just so folks can see the different options. Again, a little bit of a crude analogy, but you can think of the cloud block level as how Defender responds if I experience executable, looks like it may be suspicious, and I don't have a known good signature based on a hash value for it, right? So one of the cool things about Defender and the scale of Microsoft is all that data can say, well, hey, if a process called edge.exe has been executed on over 1 billion devices worldwide with no negative repercussions, we can kind of say it's safe. Cloud block level operates at the opposite end of the spectrum, where it'll say, well, hey, we've never seen this executable before, so maybe we want to inspect it a little bit more. And so what it can do is, based on the level you specify here, that kind of says, well, to what level should we interrogate this file? Pause the execution of it before we allow it to launch. Therefore, maybe on my developer environments where they're doing a lot of stuff with new code, I might either want to leave that at default or put it to high. But on devices that are more static, that are maybe more high risk, like domain controllers and certificate servers, zero tolerance might be reasonable there. And zero tolerance is kind of a cool name, but basically what it says is, it says, unless this file is known to be good by Microsoft's own definitions, we're not really allowed to proceed. So it's quite similar to the ASR rule that does a similar thing there. And so what you can do is you can have different policies that have these different cloud block levels and then just target them out depending on the level of security and productivity a user needs on their device.
So, but based on that concept, so you have level 1, 2, 3, meaning level 1 is not so restricted, medium restricted, and super restricted. Can you now do exceptions? No, right? Because the most excluded one, or like the most strict one, is enforced. So
you can still do exclusions, yeah.
can you do this? Can you then now have another group and say, I don't know, Larifari losers, it's a German thing, Larifari users. They can do everything, and then you put them in a separate group and now say for them, everything else is different.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, so you can really tune it to what you need insofar as, let's say, maybe my default position is I've got 3 groups and those correspond to high plus, or zero tolerance, right? And that determines the level of the cloud block level. But if you need more nuance to it, well, you could have another group and you take that group and for your policies, you exclude them. You exclude that new group from all your other policies, and then you target a new policy at those.
Okay, you have to remove them from the other policies though, right? So they can't
Yes.
be, yeah. Okay.
Spot on. So you just, when it comes to your assignment, you just say, hey, don't assign them this policy, assign them the other one.
Yeah. You can't say, okay, the whole policy applies, but I make for that thing an exception. You have to have a new policy with everything else configured, and then, yeah.
Well, it's a really good point because in a way you can do that insofar as the way that Defender antivirus policies work is they merge. So as an example, what I could do is I could set up a policy here that says not configured for any of this cloud block level stuff. And then I've got a policy that maybe rolls out all my settings except for the cloud
Mhm.
block level. And then I'm going to have a policy that's just for the cloud block level, apply that to who I need, and then it will merge. And so I guess maybe the conclusion here is, architecting these policies, there's so much flexibility and it really just depends on what you exactly need. But there's a ton of options in there.
No, but I love that because this model of like policy, like not have 5 million policies, have a good overview. Of course, I understand that there is the need for more granularity, which allows you to do this with different policies. But once in a while, try to bring them together again and maybe even see that there's the same policy that you have multiple times and merge them and delete them.
Yeah. One more thing that might be worth talking about is we have a ton of options here in the Defender portal for client security. There are few that you still have to manage through Intune or through group policy. So for example, if I head over to Intune Admin Center and I'll go to Devices, I'll head to Windows, Configuration.
You've done this a few times, right?
I sure have. So here's an example of some of the settings that you can currently only do through Intune and you can't get them in the Defender portal. So the reason they're separate is maybe because they're a little bit more, dare I say, they're just a little bit more of an edge case, right? These may not be settings that everyone wants to go away and configure, maybe a little bit more advanced scenarios. So as an example, bit of a niche setting here called Quick Scan Include Exclusions, where, hey, if I'm running a quick scan,
Yeah.
I might have set up exclusions, but also cover them now. You can control that over in Intune. The same for something called performance mode, which is to do with Windows Dev Drive that was introduced in Windows 11. And then maybe the more important one to cover is something called enable file hash computation. And that's very useful for improving the accuracy of indicators of compromise, right? So if I specify a file hash, turning this on will make that far more reliable. So if you really want to get into kind of advanced Defender for endpoint configuration scenarios, make sure that folks head to the Intune Admin Center or group policy and check out those settings as well.
I didn't know there's settings that are not there yet. So
See, that's
um,
good. I caught you out. That's excellent.
yes, I need to check with the engineering side of the house if there's a reason. Probably there is.
I, you know, I'd be interested in that answer as well. And because one of the interesting points is enable file hash computation. You can do it in Defender for Mac OS and Linux, but you can't do it for Windows.
Yeah. Maybe missed, forgotten. I don't know. I will figure out.
I didn't want to say it, but yeah.
Okay. Ru, that was a lot to see. I love it. I love your concept. I love you bringing this topic to the Ninja Show and sharing best practices. I recommend everyone who wants to go deeper and then also understand really the individual features and functionality to go grab your book, right? When is the new version coming out of the book?
It'll be out later this year, date to be confirmed. But hey, if you follow me on LinkedIn and X and all that good stuff, you'll be the first to know.
Perfect. Okay. So again, thank you so much for joining, and I hope I will have you back. And until then, everyone else, thank you. Bye.